We have seen that in recent days, many new things have emerged in Russia's actions against both Ukraine and Western countries. This includes not only the use of new ballistic missile systems and missiles, but also continued sabotage of critical infrastructure, including communications infrastructure in NATO countries on their territory. In particular, 2 fiber optic cables were found cut in the Baltic Sea. There was information about a ship of Chinese origin that was allegedly arrested by Danish warships and escorted to Danish ports for further investigation. At the same time, there is evidence that a Russian citizen was in command of this vessel. This may be a new practice on the part of Russia, and the question arises as to what it is aimed at. What is the significance for Russia of cutting the following communication infrastructure in European countries? And is it a threat to the security of NATO countries? This is not a new practice. These capabilities were acquired back in the Soviet era, and they are 50 years old. At that time, a special division of hydrocarbons was created, the so-called Main Directorate for Deepwater Research, one of whose tasks was to search for and destroy or control such submarine cables. And the fact that such a threat exists has been discussed for years, both in the North Atlantic Alliance and in individual Western countries. Serious studies have been conducted and are publicly available. The development of technology, in turn, encourages the use of submarine cables, as this is the cheapest and most reliable way to transmit information and energy underwater. There are a lot of these cables, their location is open, and there is a website that allows you to track their location. The peculiarity of the Baltic Sea is that it is not very deep. The average depth is 200 meters. That is, it is possible to carry out not very serious deep water work here. By the way, these hydraulic oil rigs go down to depths of up to 6 kilometers. They have special equipment. In the North Sea, there is a base near Severomorsk, where there are 2 Naziums converted from strategic submarines that carry small titanium submarines, and they can go to very serious depths. But for the Baltic Sea, there are enough other vehicles, both manned and unmanned, to do the job. Russia has significantly strengthened its so-called graphic fleet, which are vessels that look civilian but are actually conducting underwater reconnaissance. Over the past 10 years, they have built several such vessels. Interestingly, they have recently completed the construction of 1 ship, and all the components of this ship, units and mechanisms, were bought in the West. Russia now sees that its position in the Baltic Sea is weak. It controls only 7% of the coast, and 40 years ago it controlled 50%. Russia needs to ensure free navigation from its ports of Primorsk and Ust-Luga, through which it exports large amounts of oil. Therefore, they are looking for ways to influence their neighbors, which are NATO countries. There is no Montreux Convention, so any ships, including American ships, can enter. That's why they found this vulnerability. Damage to the cable could cause serious problems for the economy. Of course, there is no evidence that these units did it, but if you look at the logic and motives, you can build a certain chain. It is interesting that in 2021, around Norway, a little to the north in the Barents Sea, but, there is a methodology of the three bins, Black and Baltic Seas, and Russia behaves in them in a fairly similar way. So around Norway, this developed country, they put hydrophones for scientific research, and I think they could record the deployment of Russian submarines. And in two places on the Norwegian shelf, significant parts of this underwater equipment, weighing several tons, were found, and they disappeared in an unknown direction. That is, it is impossible to do this without special equipment. Now, a similar situation is arising in the Baltic. There are suspicions about this Chinese vessel, but I can say that there are different ways to do this. However, the fact that Russia has an interest in influencing both NATO and individual member states is obvious. Therefore, I think they will conduct investigations, take preventive measures, and use unmanned underwater systems to monitor their facilities. Perhaps they will install underwater hydroacoustic stations to observe what threats may be approaching. This is a serious issue, and it has now entered an active phase. I think that countries for which these submarine cables are important for their economies need to respond to this. I would also like to mention our naval forces. Recently, our Navy released information reminding us that on October 29, 2022, Ukrainian drones successfully damaged the flagship of the Russian fleet, Admiral Makarov, and other ships. The operation of the Navy and the Security Service of Ukraine using surface drones led to the withdrawal of a part of the Russian fleet from Crimea. And over the past year, the number of Russian ships in our Crimea has significantly decreased. After the success of the operations, a maritime unmanned systems unit was created as part of the Ukrainian Navy. Little is known about this unit, what tasks it performs, and how successful it is. 2/3 of the Black Sea Fleet's ships remain in the temporarily occupied Crimea, but they are mostly old ships and support vessels. The problem is that there is nowhere to transfer them, and there is no point in destroying them, as they are either not military or have no significant military effect against us. But the missile ships that fire at us have become our main target, and it was the attack on the Admiral Makarov that confirmed this. So, the ships in Crimea are really blocked. They rarely go to sea. The ships that have moved to Novorossiysk also mostly stay at the base. But when there is a possibility of an attack, for example, with Storm Shadow missiles, they go out to sea to avoid being hit, because they can be targets for such missiles while docked at the berths. By the way, we had a practice when we hit enemy missile and amphibious ships with Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles while they were anchored in the bays of Sevastopol and Kerch, and there were very serious damages. The ships were either completely destroyed or sustained serious damage that put them out of service for several years. As for this unit, there is information that it is operating, and I understand that it deals with maritime drones, conducts operations within operations, and in NATO it is called C4I, Command Control, Communications, Computers, and Intelligence. I think that everything else should be official information. And, well, if after the end of hostilities, I think we will get more detailed information. I know that now the Russians have seriously increased the defense system of Crimea through the participation and involvement of their naval aviation, and this complicates the work of our maritime drones. But we know that our military-industrial complex, together with our partners, continues this work, looking for new ways to identify critical vulnerabilities of the enemy, as well as their forces at sea, perhaps underwater, to be utilized through unmanned systems. In general, I believe that unmanned systems will play a very, very serious role, namely in the implementation of basic operations, sea control, and preventing the enemy from entering the sea after the end of hostilities. But this will be in conjunction with manned systems, although unmanned systems are actually ideal, for example, for finding and destroying sea mines at shallow depths where a ship is not needed, which is much more expensive and, incidentally, vulnerable. Such systems can be used to destroy enemy ships, destroy enemy coastal infrastructure, and even destroy submarines after certain modifications. So I think there are a lot of prospects here, but we must also take into account that the enemy does not stand still and is constantly looking for ways to counteract. As for our successes, I would like to see that, in addition to the fact that we have closed the Russian fleet in their basing points and partially pushed them out of Crimea, there is information about the fact that we are somehow beginning to liberate 80% of the coastal areas currently occupied by the enemy, opening ports that are currently located on the territory controlled by us, but the enemy actually prohibits navigation from them. I mean Mykolaiv, Ochakiv, and Kherson. This is a very important task, and I think that the steps that are being taken now are contributing to this. This is the situation in general. Andrii, thank you. We see that the innovation of unmanned systems at sea is an extremely important step and stage in our confrontation with the enemy. And these innovations are being developed by all parties to the conflict and this war. Andrii Ryzhenko was with us, and we talked about the war at sea and Russia's sabotage in the Baltic Sea, in the region in Northern Europe, where Russians are using their various ships and vehicles to destroy Europe's critical infrastructure. Next, let's move on to other important topics, as new details are emerging about the shelling of Dnipro by a Russian medium-range missile, or perhaps not medium-range, but longer-range. Putin was talking about medium-range, but yesterday there was information that Russia could have used a modified Rubis intercontinental missile. To understand, the average range of the missile is from 1 to 3,000 kilometers, according to the US and NATO classification. Russia has a slightly different idea of medium range. They classify missiles that fly up to 5 or even 5,500 kilometers as such. Putin called the missile that came down the Dnipro yesterday Oreshnik. Thus, they claimed that it was something new, experimental, and had never been used before, that it had never been used in combat missions of any kind. After all, as we know, Russia has not used other intercontinental missiles for combat missions either. However, information is emerging from the Pentagon and sources in the West that Russia did use the Rubish missile, or Rubez, as it is called in Russia, And this is just the name Oreshnik, an attempt to camouflage the fact that this missile is actually already known, just slightly modified, perhaps reworked, but nothing more. However, despite the fact that we have such versions, nowadays, at the site of the crash of this missile in the Dnipro, various fragments and details of what actually came are being found, and quite interesting discoveries and assumptions are emerging on this topic. CNN received a photo of the missile fragment. That hit the Dnipro on November 21st from a source in the Ukrainian security forces. Although it is not necessarily a piece of this particular missile, the photo was published. A Western official doubts it was an intercontinental ballistic missile. Ці такі фрагменти до однієї з ракет, але тим не менше ось це було знайдено. І каже неназваний західний чиновник, що він сумнівається у тому, наприклад, що ця ракета була саме МБР. І власне ці фотографії, які отримали... The photos have been sent to experts for analysis, and they suggest that the part found at the crash site could be part of the Bulava missile, which began mass production in the late 2000s. This could indicate the use of less advanced technology than that described by Putin. Ця деталь, яку ми ще не з вами бачили, вона вироблялася для ракети Булава. І от серійне виробництво цієї ракети тривало з кінця 2000-х років. Це може свідчити про те, як кажуть аналітики, що в ракеті, яку застосовували... The technologies used may not be as new as Putin said in his video address. The journalist of Radio Liberty drew attention to the part numbers, which revealed that back in 2013, a contract was signed on the state procurement website to develop documentation for the production of a spare part for the SK-30 complex. Another name is the R-30 Bulava intercontinental ballistic missile. In fact, this missile is not the newest in the Russian arsenal. Its development began in the 90s, and it was tested in 2005. In 2007, serial production began, and in 2012, it was adopted. The use of parts from this Bulava that we are seeing now, the pieces, probably from a newer Russian missile, may cast doubt on the use of new technologies. This conclusion was reached by analysts who saw photos of the parts found at the site of the crash in the Dnipro River. Volodymyr Zelensky said that the examinations are ongoing and the characteristics of the missile will be established. Regarding this missile, yesterday Defense Express published a large article about how many such intercontinental missiles Russia has in total. Previously, it was about 521 such land and sea-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. And by the way, this material was about these Bulava missiles that we have just talked about, that we have just seen. So, out of all the 521 intercontinental missiles in Russia, 112 units are in the Russian army. According to Defense Express experts, production started in 2012, and in general, it began in 2007 and has been actively deployed since 2012. So we can see that perhaps the devil is not as bad as he is painted, and what Putin said yesterday cannot be taken absolutely as true. In fact, what was launched will be determined by an expert, what kind of missile it was, how many of them Russia may have, and how actively the Russians are producing them. The Bulava was de facto adopted in 2012, but legal approval lasted until May 2024, during the war with Ukraine. It is a sea-launched intercontinental missile, and it is possible that parts of different Russian missiles are similar and used in different types. That's why a component, part, or element was found in the Dnipro that is used in the Bulava and possibly in the Rubish missile, or in the Oreshnik. It's the same story, actually, but the Russians just used different names.